Welcome to Heritage Food Stories, Episode 11, The Forgotten History of Indian Indentureship in the Caribbean. In today's episode, we're diving deep into the history of the Indian people who came to the Caribbean, the challenges they faced with identity, and how they helped shape the region's multi-ethnic culture and rich culinary traditions. I'm your host, Chef Mireille, chef, food historian, and culinary storyteller with a lifelong passion for global cuisines, culinary history, and the stories behind the food we eat. Indo-Caribbean communities in the Caribbean diaspora trace their roots to Indian indentured laborers who were brought to the Caribbean after the abolition of slavery in the 19th century. Their story reveals how migration, colonial history, and cultural resilience shaped a unique Indo-Caribbean identity that continues to influence Caribbean culture, cuisine, and society today. However, despite globalization and the internet, many people are still largely uninformed and unschooled on the history and identity of Indo-Caribbean people. Imagine being told you are not Indian enough when your ethnicity and heritage is 100% Indian. And on the other side, being told you are not West Indian enough or Caribbean enough, even though your family has been in the Caribbean for nearly 200 years and has influenced Caribbean culture in countless ways. As many Indo-Caribbean people just celebrated Pagua last week, let's take a look at who they are, their history, identity, and place in Caribbean culture. Before we go any further, you will notice that I sometimes use the terms West Indian and Caribbean interchangeably. So what exactly is the difference, and do people prefer one over the other? The answer is complicated because both terms come from colonial history and both carry baggage. For a long time, West Indian was the more common term, and honestly, we can blame Christopher Columbus for that. Columbus was searching for a western route to India, but I guess his compass was glitchy, and he sailed into the Caribbean instead. When he encountered the indigenous communities of the region, including the Taino and the Arawak peoples, he believed he had reached India. Because of that mistake, Europeans began referring to the region as the West Indies and the people who lived there as West Indians. The name stuck. Over time, it became a general term used to describe anyone from the Caribbean, regardless of ethnicity or ancestry. But the term Caribbean also has a complicated and uncomfortable history. The word Caribbean is connected to the indigenous Kalinago people, who lived across parts of the Lesser Antilles. European colonizers referred to them as Caribs, a name that distorted their actual identity. Spanish writers in the 16th century went even further and linked the word Carib to the Latin word canis, meaning dog, in an effort to portray them as savage and uncivilized. Colonial accounts also spread accusations that the Kalinago people practiced cannibalism. Modern historians widely recognize that these claims were unsubstantiated and were used as propaganda to justify conquest, enslavement, and violence against indigenous communities. So both terms carry the weight of colonial narratives. West Indian comes from Columbus's geographical mistake, while Caribbean comes from a colonial reinterpretation of indigenous identity. Today, many people still use both terms, often interchangeably. In some contexts, West Indian remains common, particularly in diaspora communities. Others prefer Caribbean because it feels less tied to the colonial framework of the West Indies. Neither term is perfect, but both reflect the layered and complicated history of the region. So now let's take a deep dive into Indo-Caribbean people in the West Indies. In recent years, with globalization and the internet, people have become more informed. However, it was not always like that. I would often meet Indian people who were surprised that curry and roti is part of some of our cultural cuisines and that I have Indian heritage. Unfortunately, the education system in India did not teach how Indian people were sent around the world from Fiji to Guyana during British colonization as indentured servants in the 1800s. They didn't learn how many Indian people never returned to India after their contracts ended and stayed in the Caribbean, so that today Indo-Caribbean people make up a vibrant part of Caribbean culture. When many people imagine the Caribbean, they picture beaches, reggae, and a population that is almost entirely black. That assumption is incredibly common. It is also historically inaccurate. The Caribbean is one of the most culturally diverse regions in the world. Africans, Europeans, indigenous peoples, Syrian and Lebanese merchants, and indentured servants from China, Indonesia for the Dutch Caribbean, and India all became part of Caribbean societies over centuries of migration, colonization, and survival. Today, millions of people in the Caribbean trace their ancestry to India. The largest Indo-Caribbean populations are in Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Suriname. In these countries, Indian culture blended with multi-ethnic Caribbean culture to create something completely unique. Yet, Indo-Caribbean identity often exists in a complicated space. Too Indian for some people, not Indian enough for others, and frequently misunderstood by outsiders who do not realize that Caribbean identity has always been multicultural. To understand Indo Caribbean identity, we first have to go back to the end of slavery. Slavery in the British Caribbean was abolished in 1834. In 1848 in the French islands, and finally in 1863 in the Dutch Caribbean. Plantation owners immediately faced a crisis. The formerly enslaved African population, understandably, did not want to continue working under plantation conditions that had defined generations of brutality and exploitation. Many left the plantations, started villages, farmed their own land, or moved into other types of work. For plantation owners whose profits depended on sugar and the back-breaking work of cutting cane, this created a labor shortage. Their solution was the indenture system. Beginning in the 1830s, colonial governments started recruiting laborers from India. These workers signed contracts that usually lasted 5 years. In exchange, they were promised wages, housing, and eventually the option of a return passage to India or land in the colony. Between 1838 and 1920, approximately 500,000 Indians were transported to the Caribbean under indenture contracts. About 350,000 stayed permanently, forming the foundation of the Indo-Caribbean population today. Most of the migrants came from northern India, particularly regions that are now Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Many were rural agricultural workers already struggling with poverty, drought, and economic hardship under British colonial rule. Recruiters often painted an appealing picture of opportunity overseas. The reality, however, was harsh, with cruel and barbaric living conditions. Indentured workers were transported across what many called the Kalapani, or dark waters, on journeys that lasted several months. When they arrived in the Caribbean, they found themselves working on sugar plantations in systems that, while technically were different from slavery, could still be extremely oppressive. This is not to equate indentured servants with chattel slavery, but simply to highlight the harsh realities of indentured servitude. Plantation discipline, low wages, rape, and restrictions on movement meant that indenture often resembled another form of controlled labor. Yet despite these conditions, Indo-Caribbean communities took root and eventually flourished. Where Indian people settled in the Caribbean. Indian indentured laborers were sent to many Caribbean colonies, but the largest populations developed in three places: Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. Guyana received the largest number. Between 1838 and 1916, about 238,000 Indians were brought to British Guyana. Today, their descendants make up about 40% of the population. Trinidad and Tobago received approximately 143,000 Indian indentured laborers between 1845 and 1916, and Indo-Trinidadians today make up about 35% of Trinis. Suriname, then a Dutch colony, received about 34,000 Indian laborers beginning in 1873. Other countries that received Indian indentured servants include Jamaica, Guadeloupe, Martinique, French Guyana, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, as well as St. Kitts and Nevis. Although the Caribbean became home to hundreds of thousands of Indian migrants, whose descendants now number in the millions, coexistence with different ethnic communities was not a fairy tale. When discussing Indo-Caribbean history, it is also important to address the tensions that developed between Indian indentured laborers and the formerly enslaved African population. This part of the story is often simplified or avoided, but it is central to understanding the social dynamics of many Caribbean societies. When slavery was abolished, plantation owners lost their primary labor force. Many formerly enslaved Africans understandably refused to continue working under plantation conditions that closely resembled the system they had just escaped. When Indian people arrived, they were another form of cheap labor so that the black workers could not find gainful employment earning a fair wage. This reshaped the social structure of the colonies. Plantation owners often used Indian laborers as a way to pressure Afro-Caribbean workers who were demanding better wages and conditions. The existence of a new labor force, willing or forced to work under contract, created competition for jobs and resources. This fueled resentment between communities who were both, in different ways, victims of colonial exploitation. Colonial administrations also encouraged separation between the groups. Indians were often housed in separate barracks, practiced different religions, spoke different languages, and were socially isolated from Afro-Caribbean communities. These divisions were not accidental. They were part of a broader colonial strategy often described as divide and rule. Over time, these divisions hardened into social and political tensions that still shape some Caribbean societies today. Guyana is one of the clearest examples. The country has two large populations, Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese, and political parties have historically drawn strong support along ethnic lines. Elections in Guyana have often reflected these divisions, with political rhetoric sometimes reinforcing racial tensions rather than healing them. Issues of racism and anti-Blackness have also surfaced within parts of Indo-Caribbean communities, just as anti-Indian prejudice has existed in other spaces. These tensions are rooted in a long history of colonial manipulation, economic competition, and political struggle. Acknowledging this history is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. The story of Indo-Caribbean communities is not just about migration and cultural resilience. It is also about the ways colonial systems deliberately created divisions between oppressed groups in order to maintain power. Understanding that context helps explain why identity in the Caribbean can still be complicated today. While their arrival began as colonial labor strategy, the cultural legacy that emerged was far deeper. Over generations, Indo Caribbean communities built lives that blended Indian traditions with Caribbean realities. Languages evolved. Bhojpuri and other North Indian dialects influenced Caribbean speech patterns and gave rise to languages like Suriname and Suriname. Religion remains central. Hinduism and Islam continue to be practiced across the Caribbean, and festivals like Diwali, Bagua, and Eid became part of national culture in many countries. Music also transformed. In Trinidad and Guyana, Indian rhythms blended with Caribbean styles to create Caribbean music genres like chutney and chutney soca. Food, of course, became one of the most visible cultural legacies. Roti, dal, curry, and spices from India became staples across the Caribbean. But like everything else in the region, they evolved into something uniquely Caribbean. Yet identity for Indo-Caribbean people has often been complicated. For many Indians from India, Indo-Caribbean people may seem distant from what they consider traditional Indian culture. After more than a century in the Caribbean, languages changed, customs adapted, and food evolved. Indian people often have xenophobic bias towards Indo-Caribbean people. At the same time, Indo-Caribbean communities have sometimes been told they are not Caribbean enough, particularly by outsiders who assume that Caribbean people are all black. This misunderstanding is especially common outside the region. Someone might hear a Guyanese or a Trini accent and then feel confused when the speaker looks South Asian. Questions like, where are you really from, are extremely common for Indo-Caribbean people living abroad. Not to mention some people not knowing the difference between Guyana and Ghana. Just like Afro-Caribbean, Chinese Caribbean, Syrian Caribbean, and indigenous Caribbean communities, Indo-Caribbean people are part of the region's complex cultural history. In the same way Emancipation Day and Getikoti in Suriname is celebrated, Indian Arrival Day is also commemorated in Caribbean countries like Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Jamaica, and the rest. One of the most fascinating ways Indo-Caribbean culture developed is through food. Indian culinary traditions blended with the ingredients, colonial histories, and cultural influences of different Caribbean territories. The result is a wide range of Indo-Caribbean dishes that vary depending on whether the colony was British, Dutch, or French. In the British Caribbean, particularly Trinidad and Guyana, Indian food became deeply embedded in everyday cuisine. Roti became one of the most iconic foods of the region. In Trinidad, it is often served as dal puri, stuffed with split ground peas, or busapshat, filled with curry chicken, goat, chana, chickpea curry, or vegetables. Curries also evolved to reflect Caribbean ingredients and cooking styles. While many of the same spices used in Caribbean curries are used in India, they are used in different quantities. So curries from the Caribbean have a very different flavor profile than Indian curry recipes, whether it be North Indian or South Indian cuisine. Street foods such as doubles in Trinidad or duck curry in Guyana reflect this fusion of cultures, or the traditional Guyanese seven curry. These dishes combine Indian cooking techniques and spices with locally available ingredients and Caribbean taste preferences. Yet cuisine does not evolve in a vacuum. So although pilau was brought to the Caribbean by Indian people, the inclusion of ingredients like browning, which is burnt sugar, is uniquely Caribbean. In islands with smaller Indo-Caribbean communities like St. Lucia, unique fusion dishes were created, like St. Lucian dal, a fried pastry stuffed with curried chana dal and saltfish, dried salted cod. Now let's go to the Dutch Caribbean. In Suriname, Indo-Surinamese cuisine has its own distinct identity. Many descendants of Indian indentured laborers in Suriname speak Suriname, a language derived from Bhojpuri and Awadhi dialects. Surinamese curries are often served with roti, similar to Trinidad and Guyana, but the cuisine also reflects Dutch colonial influences and interactions with Indonesian, Chinese, and Creole food traditions. One example is the inclusion of hard-boiled eggs in many of their meat curries. This tradition is similar to how hard-boiled eggs are included in West African stews. This is how Indo-Caribbean cuisine evolved by cultural exchange with the other ethnicities in the Caribbean. This created a culinary landscape where roti shops sit alongside Indonesian warangs and Creole restaurants, reflecting Suriname's multicultural history. Indian influence in the French Caribbean developed in a slightly different way than in the British colonies, but it has left an equally important mark on the region's cuisine. In the French territories of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guyana, curry became known as colombo. Like in the British Caribbean, plantation owners turned to India to replace enslaved labor on sugar plantations. Many of the workers recruited for the French colonies came from Tamil Nadu in South India and from Sri Lanka. With them, they brought their culinary traditions, including curry dishes and complex spice blends. The word colombo is widely believed to be a French adaptation of the Tamil word kuzambu, which refers to a spicy gravy or curry sauce. As the dish was adopted into French Caribbean Creole cuisine, the name gradually evolved into colombo. Another explanation sometimes cited is that the name comes from the city of Colombo in Sri Lanka, since some of the indentured laborers originated from that region. Over time, the term became a general descriptor of both the spice blend and the stew itself, regardless of the specific origin of the migrants. While the roots of the dish clearly trace back to Indian curry traditions, the Caribbean version developed its own identity. French Caribbean colombo is typically milder than many Indian curries. One of its distinctive characteristics is the addition of roasted ground rice in the spice blend, which helps thicken the sauce and gives it a slightly different texture than most South Asian curries. The spice blend itself still reflects its Indian origins, usually containing turmeric, coriander, cumin, fenugreek, cardamom, dried chilies, mustard seeds, and other spices. But the dish evolved as it interacted with local Caribbean ingredients and Creole cooking traditions. Lime juice, Caribbean root vegetables, and sometimes coconut milk are incorporated into the dish, creating a flavor profile that sits somewhere between Indian curry and Caribbean stew. In Guadeloupe, colombo became so embedded in the local food culture that pork colombo became the national dish. Just like roti and curry in Trinidad or Guyana, colombo is a reminder of how Indian culinary traditions did not simply survive in the Caribbean, they transformed, blended with local ingredients, and became an essential part of Creole cuisine. Although the name is different, the roots of the dish still trace back to the same history of Indian migration and adaptation. Food, like identity, carries memory. Every plate of roti, every pot of curry, and every bowl of dal tells a story of migration, survival, and cultural resilience. The story of Indo-Caribbean people is ultimately a Caribbean story. It is a story of people who crossed oceans under difficult circumstances and built new lives in unfamiliar lands. It is a story of cultural persistence, where traditions survived even as they adapted to new environments. And it is also a reminder that Caribbean identity has never been simple. It is intersectional. You can be both Indian and Caribbean. The Caribbean has always been a melting pot of cultures, which is why even new ethnicities like Dubla, people who are mixed with both Black and Indian heritage, evolved in the Caribbean. African, Indian, Indigenous, European, Chinese, and Middle Eastern influences all shape the region in different ways. Understanding Indo Caribbean history helps us see the Caribbean more clearly, not as a place defined by one culture or one identity, but as a place where many histories intersect. And perhaps that is the most Caribbean thing of all. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can explore over 1,000 recipes from around the world on my website, linked in the show notes. Whether you're cooking tonight or just curious, there's something there for you. I'm Chef Mireille. See you next time.